I want to start. I read that Hans Zimmer said that there's a very specific sound to Iceland composers. So I was curious what Icelandic sound is, or what about living there, growing up there, created this distinct sound.
Mm, yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm the best equipped person to describe my own sound or the sound of Icelandic composers, but I can certainly say that growing up in Iceland was a great place to be as a young musician. Um, it's funny when you get more than like three Icelanders or more than two Icelanders together, they'll just start singing. It's just a very sort of there is a yeah, there's just that sort of core musical
Hmm.
element to Icelanders for some reason. And I get this question so much. It's like, what's in the water in Iceland? Why are there so many musicians coming out of Iceland? And I think there's a lot of sort of tangible reasons, like there's good music schools.
Hmm.
Icelanders kind of we really participate in music. We really sort of from a young age you're kind of involved in it. But you know, I don't know. With time, you kind of reflect on these things, and I do think that just the landscape and maybe a little bit of feeling of isolation and sort of these huge vistas. I tend to think that some of that can be heard in my music and in the music of my fellow countrymen
Hmm.
and women.
Hmm. And you worked on Silo season one and returned for season two. So what are the easiest and hardest parts of coming back for a second season?
Well, I suppose the easy part is I had a few tunes ready to reuse,
Hmm.
and the wheel has been invented, if you will. Uh, but the tricky bit is to kind of create a sound and build a world for a different silo, which
Hmm.
is completely different from the one that we saw in season one. And I mean, it's kind of a double-edged sword to have the tunes from season one because you don't want to repeat yourself.
Hmm.
You need to sort of stay true to the show, but also it's important to find a way to kind of reinvent those tunes as well and sort of keep an evolution going.
Hmm. And for the second silo, I mean, that is it's probably one of the biggest reveals that we get in the second season. But they started as very similar silos, but then they obviously diverged because they were secluded from one another. So where do you draw the line of making themes that reference each other while also making its own distinct sonic world?
Well, I think that, I mean, the obvious biggest difference between the two silos is that one of them is filled with people and
Hmm.
the other one just has a few souls living in there. So I suppose the hustle and bustle of the first one, kind of lends itself to a bit more, I don't know, humanity perhaps. And the second season is much more about kind of this alien, isolated, really lonely world that Juliet and Solo and everybody else there is experiencing. So
Hmm.
I would say that's kind of what was my sort of biggest kind of sort of guidepost was to just kind of how do I make this feel really really lonely, as if it wasn't lonely enough uh, living with 10,000 people in a box in a kind of a capsule in the ground. So that was kind of it. It was just like, how do I make this feel even stranger, even more insular and lonely.
And so you mentioned loneliness when you were talking about Icelandic composers. Did you then, because there's similar themes, did you use Icelandic instruments or like melodies that more closely related to that?
Well, not so much melodic material.
Mhm.
Well, not on purpose anyway.
Mhm.
It's entirely possible that I'm constantly stealing from my musical culture, as it were. But I did. Well, yeah, there was actually a couple of Icelandic instruments being used. So what I did for season two is I basically took a bunch of all kinds of instruments to a silo in Iceland, which is like a decommissioned herring oil
Mm,
silo from the 40s or 50s or something like that, maybe even a little bit older. Anyway, it's just been empty for decades, and but it's got an incredibly cool acoustic or sort of yeah, it's a world in and of itself,
hmm
and that's something that I've been really kind of fascinated with in the past few years is sort of this idea of not just capturing, a sound and a melody or something, or like a piece of music, but actually capturing a space.
mm.
Because I think that there's like kind of an added dimension that comes from being in a space that relates to the story in a way like that.
hmm And I think with all the reverb in the world from a computer, you're never going to get the same as what it sounds like when you record in something that's a decommissioned silo.
True. I mean, I think the reverb tail, we measured it. It's between 11 and 12 seconds.
Wow.
But then weirdly, I just kept adding more reverb to it. So it was a bit of a reverb fest,
hmm
and but yeah, but it's like somehow when that reverb is baked into the sound,
hmm
it can still take more ambience and kind of you fit it into the rest of the sonic world that you're working with. But there's just something about that, as you're saying, that reverb, that patina that comes from being in a space like that, that is
hmm
very hard or probably impossible to do with a plugin.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting about the show when it comes to sort of like the artistic behind the scenes of it is that the show itself, the characters are so focused on utility and productivity and just surviving to an extent. But then they're not really doing art for pleasure. So how do you, as a composer, create something that is utilitarian but also deeply emotional and moving when it's
Hmm.
foreign to these characters?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, yeah, I suppose there really there's a little bit in the beginning of season one where you see people actually playing music,
hmm
but there's no radio or internet or anything like that in the silo, and it's like people aren't really consuming music,
hmm
and so I think there's one tiny little sort of dinner scene, like dinner music that I had to produce in season one. But I suppose it's sort of the difference between people, like I said, listening to or consuming music as opposed to the music being a storytelling device.
hmm
And so the music is kind of sort of it lives both inside and outside of the silo, if you will, because
hmm
it's designed for the audience to experience the world
hmm
within the silo. And of course, I mean, the reason music is put in film and television is to give it that sort of almost like a third dimension, which is that emotional response we have to it.
hmm
So really, it's no different than any other show. You're telling the story through music, and I think I maybe just I hadn't really thought about what you asked me, and probably that was a good thing because I think you could overthink that to an extent. So for me, it was just like, you know, what is the story? How are these people feeling, etc. So I just went into it with that, you know, um, with that point of view.
Yeah. Well, that's my time. So thank you so much, Atli. It was beautiful score for this season. I'm excited to see where it goes next.
Thank you so much. Thanks for
Thank you.
having me.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye bye.